So welcome to this presentation on the provision of social care for people in prison. My name's Sue Tucker and I'm a research fellow at the University of Manchester. But as you can see, I'm part of a much bigger team, and I also wanted to acknowledge the fantastic support we've had from Lancashire County Council, the ADAS Care and Justice Network and HMPPS with this work. In the next 10 minutes or so, what I'm hoping to do is to give you a flavour of some of our research about the needs of this client group, drawing on two studies that were commissioned by the NIHR School for Social Care Research. The first of these explored the social care needs of people in custody, and the second is looking at their needs on release. I should say right at the start that the views expressed here are those of the research team, and not necessarily those of the NIHR School for Social Care Research, the Department of Health, NIHR or the NHS. So first, a bit of background, and I've pulled out three main points. So first, the general acknowledgement that the level of social care needs in prison has been increasing, not least because of the rise in the number of older prisons on the back of demographic ageing, trend towards longer sentences, improvements in forensics and a surge in retrospective prosecutions. Indeed, older men, who tend to be defined as 50 or over in this setting, now make up more than 15% of the male prison population. But there are also a number of younger people with social care needs in prison, including people with mental health problems, physical and learning disabilities, autistic spectrum disorders and long-term health conditions. Second, there have been a series of reports criticising the quality of social care in prison, which was described as at best variable and at worst non-existent. A 2014 survey, for example, found local authority social work staff were involved in assessing or meeting prisoners' needs in just a quarter of establishment, and the literature contained a wealth of examples of a deplorable lack of social care, including people with mobility impairments being allocated upper-level bunk beds. And then third, there was considerable confusion about whether or which local authorities were responsible for prisoners' social care needs, with consequent low levels of engagement. The introduction of the 2014 Care Act, which placed a number of new duties on local authorities, was very widely welcomed. This made clear that from the 1st of April 2015, the local authority in whose area prison or approved premises was located was responsible for identifying and assessing all prisoners in custody with potential social care needs, and where these met the new eligibility criteria, for providing or commissioning appropriate care and support. Further, even where people's needs didn't meet the eligibility criteria, they had a duty to look at how the prisoner's general well-being could be improved, with a view to preventing, delaying or reducing deterioration. And all authorities were responsible for the continuity of care of people who came into their area with a package of care on release. Now, when we're talking about social care needs here, the eligibility guidance sets out 10 domains of interest, so encompassing things not only like getting around safely and maintaining personal hygiene, but accessing work or education and making and maintaining relationships. And obviously people in prison will have problems with some of these things simply because they are in prison, but the guidance is very clear that in order for needs to be eligible, they have to relate to an impairment or illness, mean that the person can't achieve at least two outcomes in their day-to-day life, and that this has a significant impact on their well-being. Part of the problem with the introduction of the Care Act, however, was that no one really knew how many prisoners would be eligible for support, what their needs were, or how best to meet them. And whilst the Act set out its expectations of local authorities, it didn't stipulate how these should be delivered. Against this background, then, the first study we undertook set out to scope the nature and extent of the population's social care needs, identify who local authorities perceived to meet the criteria for the provision of social care and the extent to which there was or wasn't a consistent view across them, and explore the early arrangements they put in place to meet their new responsibilities. The study itself had three main strands. So in the first of these, we undertook face-to-face interviews with 482 prisoners in Lancashire, which has got 5 prisons catering for a wide range of people serving short and long-term sentences, albeit no Category A prison and no prisons for women. And in summary, what we found was that more than a tenth of participants had problems with or needed help to maintain their personal hygiene, dress and or get around the prison safely, and that this rose to a fifth in prisoners aged 50 or over. In addition, approaching a sixth acknowledged problems forming or maintaining relationships, and a significant minority lacked meaningful occupation. Now, we're certainly not suggesting that all of these people would be eligible for the provision of social care and support. Nevertheless, it does give some feel for the very high proportion of people in prison who could potentially benefit from some form of social care advice or support if they're able to make the best use of their time in prison, maintain their safety and dignity, and leave prison better equipped to manage in wider society. So in the second strand of the study, we identified 13 commonly found subgroups, what we've called case types, within our interview data, based on attributes such as people's need for help with activities of daily living, mental health problems, substance misuse, whether they'd had a previous prison stay. And we wrote a series of brief vignettes about them, sort of short case histories. We then shared these with 35 frontline practitioners, managers and commissioners from 9 local authorities across England as part of a series of workshops, and asked them to indicate whether they thought each of them was eligible for the provision of social care, borderline or not eligible. And if you look at the top of the table on the right here, you can see that there were 3 case types that we've named Joe, Pete and Sonny, who were unanimously considered ineligible. And these typically represented young offenders who had no physical or mental health problems and for whom this was their first time in prison. Similarly, at the bottom of the table, there were 2 case types, Chris and Richard, both of whom had difficulties maintaining their personal hygiene and mobilising, who were consistently judged to meet the criteria. In the middle, however, is a much more mixed picture, and these were people who typically had fluctuating mental health needs and past custodial experience. And when we looked at the qualitative information we collected about people's decision making, it was clear that some authorities were interpreting the criteria much more tightly than others, and that while some were largely concerned with the here and now, others were taking a much longer term outlook, expressing a desire to promote prisoners' long-term independence and change people's lives. The third strand of the study sought to identify the early arrangements that local authorities have put in place to meet their new responsibilities by means of a national survey, and we had a really good response rate, so 56% of all authorities, 81% of authorities containing prisons. And we found most had put in place some sort of process for identifying prisoners with social care needs on entry to prison, often by adding some supplementary questions to the existing healthcare screening tool. Over and above this, about half described attempts to identify existing prisoners with social care needs, but this appeared a bit ad hoc, often through routine interaction, for example, or relying on self-report, and active case finding seemed really limited. Social care assessments were almost always being undertaken by specialist social care staff, usually social workers, but sometimes also occupational therapists. But commission care and support packages were mainly provided by prison healthcare staff. This had some clear advantages, including their on-site presence and their ability to respond to changing demands. But there were sometimes issues around their capacity to undertake this work, and in contrast, some authorities had commissioned local domiciliary care providers. This brought its own problems, however, particularly around the time it took for staff to get the necessary permissions to work in prisons and the difficulty of accessing them at night or during prison lockdowns. Perhaps one of the strongest messages we took from the survey, however, was that at least in the early months following the introduction of the Care Act, the focus was very much on the needs of people in custody, and far less attention seemed to be being given to the arrangements that were needed for people on release. This is the focus of our current study, which, as you can see, is looking to identify what is known about the social care needs of this client group, the systems and processes there are for planning their release, including how information is shared and transferred, what helps and hinders good release planning, the provision of social care on release, and what specific initiatives have been developed to support this client group, not just in the UK, but internationally. So as befits an area about which very little is known, we've started with a scoping review of the international literature. And what I've tried to show on this slide is how very small we think this is. Now, I should emphasise that the figures presented here only relate to the results of our electronic database search. We are aware of a number of other core documents, so the final number of inclusions will grow, but I suspect by not that much. So out of 11,068 documents generated by our search terms, based on first a screening from titles and abstracts and then a read of the full text of the potential inclusions, what we've got at the moment are 27 actual includes, of which just 9 seem to have a real focus on the social care needs of people released from prison as might be considered eligible under the Care Act. Now, this is obviously partly an artefact of our inclusion criteria, for there are a plethora of studies out there about what you might call people's wider social care needs, including the need for housing, employment and social support, simply as a result of their having been in prison. Nonetheless, we're quite shocked to see how little there is, for example, about people who need help with daily activities of living. So we're currently bringing together the findings from our literature review and also undertaking 3 new national surveys of local authorities, prison governors and prison healthcare leads, in which we're looking at much more detail at the specific tools and processes employed to identify people who are likely to have social care needs on release from prison, the release planning process itself, including the use of multidisciplinary release planning meetings, particular groups that are hard to plan for, the use of release on temporary licence, and also looking at the difficulties transferring information between authorities and establishing ordinary residence. At the time of the recording, however, these have been suspended due to the ongoing pandemic and the huge pressure this is placing on local authority and prison staff. When we can restart this study, we're obviously hoping to complete the surveys and then to undertake a series of qualitative interviews with key professionals and service users in 4 study sites, with a view to developing our understanding of how and why problems arise in the release planning process and how best to resolve these. We're then going to hold 2 validation workshops with staff, managers, commissioners, ex-offenders and their families to explore the implications of our findings for both practice and policy. And finally, we're hoping to use this work as a sort of springboard for 2 further pieces of research. So first, a prospective longitudinal study of the relationship between social service receipt and social care outcomes on release from prison, and a separate study of the lower level social care needs of people on entry to prison, the what do I do about my dog in the shed, and the models of support that might help. If you'd like to know any more about this work, please do feel free to contact me. You can also read more detail about our work in articles in the British Journal of Social Work and the Journal of Social Work. Thank you very much for listening.